Hello. Welcome to the Contact in the Desert workshop with Anthony Peake, where we'll be discussing my concept of cheating the ferryman. Some of you, the whole concept of cheating the ferryman might be new to some of you, and indeed for some other of you, you might already be aware of it. And some of you may have even checked out talks, interviews and lectures I've done on the web over the years. This one will be quite unique, and I will be going through all the areas and all the aspects of it, and particularly focusing in on the areas that I'll be exploring in my forthcoming book, Cheating the Ferryman. I thought I'd tend to be consistent. Just a little bit of background about Cheating the Ferryman. I will explain during the workshop what I mean by cheating the ferryman. But my initial book that was written way back in 1999-2000 was actually called Cheating the Ferryman. Sadly, when I was offered a publishing deal with Arcturus, they, in their infinite wisdom, decided that probably Cheating the Ferryman would be a little bit too confusing to the readers. So what they did was they came up with a much more prosaic title of Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. I was a little bit concerned about that, but lost out in that book and my overall hypothesis has nothing to do with what happens after you die. I never discuss what happens after you die other in terms of philosophical ideas. What I talk about very much is what happens while you are still alive. So it was somewhat confusing, and I believe it's somewhat insulting to the audience and my potential book buying people that they don't understand what I mean by cheating the ferryman. I think people are a good deal more intelligent than publishers assume they are. But anyway, this will be probably the longest ever presentation I've done. It will be leading edge, and it will be bringing in an awful lot of the information that I've never really discussed with people before. So it's new. So I hope you enjoy it. I may stop halfway through, depending on whether I need a break or not, and whether I feel that I can continue on straight through. But of course, you are in the position, because this is a recording, that you can freeze it at any time you want. If you're interested in my work, I will say at the end as well, but you can contact me via Facebook, you can contact me via my website and various other locations. Also, I've got now a very active YouTube channel as well, because I do podcasts every week, and they are now going out. We've had some quite interesting guests in the past, and we have some very interesting guests forward in the future. So let's start. We all remember 9/11. We cannot forget 9/11. 9/11 is something that is probably, pre-COVID anyway, the most extraordinary series of events that we had to live through. And it's still seared on many of our minds. What is less known is that 9/11 was precognised by a number of people in the build-up to 9/11 and the events that took place. Some of these things are quite extraordinary, and if you haven't come across these before, these will, I guarantee, surprise you. The first one I'd like to focus in on is this particular image here. Now, for reasons that will become clear soon, I spent a lot of time trying to find this particular image, because you may recall after 9/11 there were a series of short video films of the events that had been taken by people who had been in New York and round the buildings on that day. And there was one particular film I recalled seeing that I never saw again, which was of a particular angle of the planes going in. And it was a gentleman, I think, he was standing up and somebody was filming him, putting down a cup of coffee on the top of his car. And in the background, you could see the Twin Towers. And just as the planes went in. Now, I managed to subsequently find that image, which is the image you see on the screen at the moment. Now, the reason I wanted to find this image was because it was quite extraordinary. And it was extraordinary for one very interesting reason, because of this. This is an album cover by the gangster rap group. I don't know if they're gangster rap, but they are a rap group called Coup. Now, as you can see with this particular image, they've clearly taken that image almost exactly. If you look at it, you can see where the explosions are coming out. So even the explosion clouds are quite similar. And you can see how the plane is impacting on one of the towers. I thought this was quite an intriguing album cover. And the guy who designed it argued that he was creating an image of the destruction of capitalism. And he had the image in his mind, and he thought it was such an arresting image he would turn it into a political statement, because clearly you can see that one of the characters in the front is implying that in some way he is responsible for the explosions, because he's got a device that seems to be causing the explosions in the buildings behind. That's all well and good, but would you be astonished if I told you that album cover was designed in January of 2001? Not only that, but the album cover had already been released or was ready for release when 9/11 took place. Indeed, what is particularly interesting in regards to the Party Music album is that the designer himself, I have heard, was called in to the FBI because they wondered how he knew what was going to be taking place. Now let's look at this in greater detail. This is an image that was created months before the incidents took place. You could say coincidence. Of course you could. You can always say things are coincidences, can't you? Anything can be a coincidence, particularly if it's something that you don't like. The idea that it could be an implication of subliminal precognition of an event. I would argue that that's not an explanation at all. The very fact of just how accurate the cover is to the explosions suggests to me that in some peculiar way the man who designed this album cover had precognized the attacks, or more importantly, and will become clearer as this develops, remembered the attacks. Now that particular image of the exploding buildings was networked on many, many TV stations. So there is a reason to believe that the designer of the album cover would have subsequently seen that image in his own future, and somehow the image back informed itself into his mind to create the idea of the album cover. The question is, how? How did he know that? But there was more. Here is music recorded live in April 2001, and the collage was created by somebody called Ion in June 2001. If you then look at a manipulated image of 9/11, and you look at the which was subsequently done, and then you look at the image that Ion had created, it's again disturbingly prescient, in my opinion. Again, do we call this coincidence? So this is now two people who have chosen this. Now one could argue they are symbols, but there are many other symbols around the world. But then we get this album by a band called Dream Theater, called Live Scenes from New York. This was a phrase that was used scores of times during the TV coverage of the 9/11 disaster, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But that was the name of the album that Dream Theater chose. Now what again is interesting here, if we look very closely, you can see the Twin Towers in flames and everything. The planned date for the release of this album was the 11th of September 2001. the exact day of the attacks. Again, in other lectures, I've gone into details of some of the lyrics that you'll find on this album, but I'll just point out two of them. Track number 3 is called Strange Deja Vu. And what is a deja vu? A deja vu is a sense that you're living something again, that you have experienced something as part of your past and you're re-experiencing it. So clearly, yet again, we have curious evidence that maybe in some subliminal way, part of us knows the future. Track number 5 was called Fatal Tragedy. Again, curious, possible coincidence, but we're now starting to build up a picture of that maybe 9/11 was in some way remembered from another time or another place. And then we get my favourite of all of these. This is a photograph of a guy called David Mandel. David Mandel was an artist, may still be. I've been trying to trace the guy with a great deal of difficulty. But on the night of the 10th of September 1996, he had an extremely vivid dream. And in the dream, he dreamt of planes hitting tall buildings in New York. He was so intrigued by this that, as an artist, he then did a drawing of what he'd seen in his dream. In order to prove that it was precognition, because he regularly had precognitive dreams, Mandel took himself up to Barclays Bank in Sudbury Hill, and holding the painting in question of the attacks, he stood underneath the bank's date machine, which he could not manipulate or change, which effectively was a date stamping of the witnesses and the events he had seen in his dream. Now, the dates work and the imagery works because the images are most peculiar, because in December 1997 he then had a subsequent dream again of the buildings being attacked, and in the pictures he drew the planes, and then he wrote underneath the picture, plane hits building, flying in different directions, hit buildings. So again, here we have not one but 2 planes. So what's the chances, if we're saying this is all just coincidence, that David Mandel chose New York for a terrorist attack? He chose the Twin Towers as part of the attack. He chose not 1 but 2 planes to hit the building. Now, to my knowledge, there's only ever been one incident of a plane hitting a building, and that was I think it was in the 1930s when a bomber, American Air Force bomber, hit the Empire State Building. It was a fairly minor incident all towards. So nobody would have effectively ever in their wildest dreams here we use the term, would have believed that terrorists or somebody would fly aircraft into a building. It just had never happened before. It's something now that we think about a lot, but it is important to state that before that had been done, it was an unthinkable thing. Nobody ever thought about it. The only time that there was even ever any form of disaster put forward was probably the movie Towering Inferno. But that wasn't the same in any shape or form. So what's going on here? What is really happening? Well, that was not the only things that Mandel did. In June 1997, he had a dream where he saw a Concorde plane with its tail on fire. He knew it was in France. In the subsequent painting, he writes Concorde crash. April 1999, he had a further dream which he heard the words, trying to reach an airport a few miles away. These were the last words this were the literal last words of the Concorde pilot before the plane crashed on July 25th, 2000. So here he actually hears the words in his mind of the plane, of the pilot. Now, again, if you look at the pictures, he's quite precise here. You see the plane with its tail on fire up here. You see another plane here with a French flag, so he's positioning it in France. And that is the image that went round the world of the plane on fire. You'll probably remember the video image. Now, as an interesting addition to this is that after I wrote my first book, I was contacted by a university lecturer in law when I lived in Liverpool. Oh, he lived in Liverpool and I lived on the Wirral. And he contacted me because he'd had a series of precognitive dreams over his life. And one of the precognitive dreams, he dreamt, and this was before the Concorde crash, he told many people about this as well, and he dreamt that he was in a hotel room overlooking an airport. He knew it was early spring because it was the nature of the trees. The trees were budding. He also felt that there was something about the atmosphere that made him believe it was France. Okay. In the dream, he goes towards the window. And as he goes towards the window, he sees Concorde fly past with its tail on fire. He then hears the impact of the plane. But this is where it gets very strange. Because he then explained to me, and he said he had recorded this earlier with other people before Concorde crashed. He heard voices, and he felt people go through him. And he distinctly recalls people talking to each other and to him in German, which made him think that the people on the plane were German. Everything he explained, but the slight time slip of the time of year, is what actually happened on July the 25th, 2000. Not only that, but the people who died on the plane were, in fact, German. So how many levels of coincidence have we got to use here to convince ourselves of the simple fact that under certain circumstances people can see the future? Because if we applied that rule to any case in a trial or anything else, you could argue that anything was a coincidence, that the murderer who committed the murder happened to coincidentally be seen in that place and coincidentally was holding the weapon. It's the same logic. How far do you go before you deny the facts? How much statistics do you have to twist in order to say it's a statistical chance? Because, for instance, one of the major explanations of these dreams is something called the law of large numbers. And in the law of large numbers, various writers have discussed this. And the idea is that in any one night, we all micro-dream. And we have 6 or 7, maybe 8 dreams a night. There are 3.5 billion people on the planet or whatever. You calculate that. There's an awful lot of dreams going on. And the logic is that in any one night, a handful of people will dream of a plane crash. And a plane crash will coincidentally happen somewhere in the world the next day. Concorde was the safest plane in the air. Concorde had never been involved in a plane crash of any description. So here we're dealing with a unique aircraft, not a generic plane. It wasn't them saying, I had a dream of a plane. They said Concorde. Then we have to extrapolate into that and input into our statistics of our law of large numbers the fact that they both knew it was in France. Starting to now get a bit statistically crazy. We then have to add to that the fact that the tail was on fire. So how many factors of chances of millions to one are we already expanding here? Then we have my friend's example of the German people being on board. We're now getting to ridiculous levels of statistical chance, but we have to believe this was just a coincidence. I have somewhere in my possession, I keep trying to find it now, but the university lecturer in question sent a telegram, or I think it was a bit of a fax in those days, to British Airways, saying that he believed that a Concorde was going to crash in France. and to be careful about it. There's evidence that he wasn't making it up. So here we have yet again science in denial of something that happens. And it's because science chooses certain things to research and others they don't. And the reason that science doesn't research it is quite simple. It's because there is no known way within modern physics, as we understand the world, that somebody can precognize future events which are yet to take place. In this workshop, I'm going to be presenting evidence of how that is totally, completely, and utterly logical. In fact, inevitable. But let's move on from here. Can we perceive the future? Is there evidence that we can perceive the future under normal circumstances? We know, for instance, that before 9/11, at the Princeton experimental laboratories, they noticed that a lot of the random number generators started going crazy just before 9/11, as if there was a collective fear in the air that people were sensing in some way, and this was affecting the random number generators. But let's look into the proper science here. Let's look at some facts that you may not be aware of, that you can now turn round to your friends when they turn round and say, precognition is nonsense. How can you possibly believe in precognition? Here's some examples from neurology and from physiology. In 1972, an experiment was done by Geldard and Sherrick, and it's called the cutaneous rabbit. This again is in an academic article. I'm not making this up. You can find the academic article yourself. So, don't everything I'm going to be presenting here, you can check it in academic papers. I'm no woo-woo person. I'm not making claims at all. I'm stating the facts as they were. And the cutaneous rabbit is quite fascinating. What you do is that you take somebody's arm and you put two tingling electrode devices on the wrist. You put another two on the elbow, and then you put another two on the shoulder, and there's an attachment. And what it does is effectively it gives a small electrical signal which goes into the shoulder, then into the middle of the arm, and then into the wrist. Now it's done in a sequence so that they feel taps. Okay, and as it says here, a pointed object quickly and evenly 5 times on another person's wrist, and it does 3 times at the elbow and twice on the upper arm. Now the taps should feel to spread along the arm. Okay, so they should feel, as the taps are done, it gives a sensation under the skin of a little creature running underneath the skin. That's why it's called the cutaneous rabbit. It's the idea of a rabbit running underneath your skin. Without exception, when this experiment is done, if they press the two at the wrist, if they have chosen to not press the two at the arm, the signal never starts running up. And subsequently at the top, the signal doesn't start. It is as if the body already knows that the signal's not going to take place in the middle of the arm or at the top of the arm. So, as it says, the phenomenon should occur before all the taps have been completed, but it doesn't. In other words, the body normally should wait until all the taps have been completed so it knows that the 3 are going to happen. But it already knows that the other taps aren't going to happen. That in itself is intriguing, but this gets stranger. No, I don't know where that's gone, bear with me. There was another experiment, which unfortunately I haven't posted here, called the Phi experiment. Can you bear with me a second? I'll just see if it's elsewhere on here. Please close your eyes so you can't see what else I'm going to be doing. There it is. Okay. This is the Phi experiment. So it's the same principle as the cutaneous rabbit. I wonder if Did one slip? No. Okay. Let's go back, and we'll go back to phi. Let's go back to phi because I think it's important that we continue logically. So that particular example I first came across in a book called Consciousness Explained, written by Daniel Dennett. Now, Daniel Dennett is what is called an eliminative materialist. Daniel Dennett does not believe that there's anything going on in your mind. He's a philosopher, I think, and a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But he argues that there is no inner life. It's an illusion. We fool ourselves into thinking we have any conscious inner life. Okay, self-evidently crazy and can be disproved by any human being by reading it. But nevertheless, Daniel Dennett used the cutaneous rabbit as an example of how the human brain works. He has something called the multiple drafts theory, which again is a fascinating idea. And if you get the opportunity, maybe check out his books. They're well worth reading. He's a highly intelligent man, but somehow got lost in his own analysis of materialist reductionism. So let's look a little bit at what's going on in terms of this perception. When we perceive these signals on our arm, or when we perceive any signals at all, like when we see something. Now, what is taking place is that there's an object out there in space, in this example, a green tree, and photons of light that may be light or a particle, which we'll touch upon later, the mysteries of photons, and light, but they then enter the retina of the eye. Okay, so they go through the eye. As an interesting aside, the photons that leave the object and bounce off the tree are not the same objects, not the same photons that go through the air, nor are they the same photons that enter your eye or hit your retina. What in fact is happening is a signal, for want of a better term, is bouncing from photon to photon. As one photon hits another photon, or indeed as a photon hits atoms in the air, atoms of the oxygen in the air, for instance, they stimulate each electron to give off a photon of light. So it's a kind of a series of signals. So even that is stranger than you can begin to understand or begin to appreciate possibly. But let's just argue that it's the same photon. It isn't, but let's argue it. That photon then enters your eye and goes through something called the aqueous humor, which is this thick jelly inside the eye. It goes through there and then it lands at the back of the eye at the retina. Now, the retina is a light-sensitive part of the brain, by the way, which is at the back of the eye. And it's postage stamp sized and it's inverted. So the image that, when all the photons hit, the image that is imprinted upon, like a camera lens, like you look at a camera and you've got the photo film, the retina is almost like the film at the back of the camera. And as the light hits, an image is developed on the retina. But that image is inverted and postage stamp sized. That image is then changed into electric signals. And those electric signals are then sent down the optic nerve from each eye, and they go back and they cross over at a place called the optic chiasma, which sits directly above the pineal gland, which is something we'll be talking about later. So bear that in mind. This is quite crucial. And the light then reverts and they go to the back of the brain here, to the visual cortex, the darkest part of the brain. There is no light there, there's no anything. Now remember, the light has already disappeared. The light has been converted into an electric signal. Then, at the back of the brain, the visual cortex takes just the coded signals it's receiving, and it's all it is, it's coded signals, and it then turns that into an image. Now remember, the original coded signal is postage stamp sized and inverted. And when it gets to the visual cortex, then creates what you see. Now look out at your world now. For a second, look above this laptop, with this computer, whatever you're watching this on, or this phone, and look at the world around you. Do you think that world you are seeing now is being created from an image that is postage stamp sized and inverted? Of course it isn't. The brain is filling in the information for you. How do we know that? We know that because at the back of your eye, within the retina, is something called the blind spot. It's where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye. There is no light sensitive areas on the retina there, which means that you continually have a spot of blindness in both your eyes, but you never see it. This is a classic example of exactly how modern people are programmed into not really thinking deeply enough on these images, on these issues. When I was at my optician's, my ophthalmologist, a few years ago, having been tested for a new pair of glasses, I mentioned this to him, and he turned around and he said, "This is utter nonsense. Of course not. We have binocular vision. We have two eyes, and we have a binocular image, and they overlap. And because they overlap, it means that the image at the back, it disappears because the eyes overlap, and we get binocular vision and stereoscopic vision." So I turned around to him and I said, "So what happens when I close one eye? Surely the blind spot should appear when I close one eye." And I'm still stunned as to what his reaction was. His reaction was, "Do you know, I'd never thought about that before." Now that to me is an example of exactly how programmed people are. They think to a certain depth, but don't go any further. They don't question because the received wisdom is, this is how the universe works. This is why some of the quantum physics we'll be talking about later has never been accepted by the general public, or indeed the vast majority of scientists who should know better. But they don't, because it makes no sense. And because it makes no sense, it's not discussed. They knew the oddities of quantum physics in the 1920s. Here we are 100 years later, and we've still got the position where it is just not discussed because it's too difficult to explain how reality really is. Okay, so going back to this, think about this for a second. Blind spot. You can do see your own blind spot, because if you move something closer and closer, there will be a point where your blind spot will appear. But ordinarily, your brain fills in the information either side of the blind spot. Now, bear this in mind. If your brain can fill in to such an extent the blind spot of your visual field, why can't it fill in the whole of your visual field? And is your visual field that you're seeing internally not really out there at all? It's not out there. Your brain is making you believe it's out there, but there's something far more complex going on here. There's another term I use called electromagnetic chauvinism. I came across this idea in one of my previous books. And it's, again, we're talking about the green tree. Okay. Now, the green is a mixture of different colours, but let's go back to the original idea of the rainbow. Okay. What light is in effect, visible light is just the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum, where I was discussing photons before, and photons carry the messages of the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum effectively is like a long line, for want of a better term, really. And at one end, you have things like gamma rays, that are very, very, sort of the frequency and whatever is really close. There's so many of them per second, millions of them per second. And then you carry on right through till you get to the other end of things like radio waves. And radio waves, the actual wavelength, is massive. We're talking feet, hundreds of feet. So there's this huge continuum of electromagnetic radiation with different levels of power. What we think is the visual world, that is everything we see and everything we perceive, is just a small part of this in the middle of it. And this is what we believe is reality out there. There is no red out there. There is no anything out there in terms of colour. Red is just how your brain interprets a particular wavelength of light. And your brain makes you see red. But red is nowhere. Red is nowhere. Red does not exist anywhere. You have no way of even knowing whether your friends see the same red as you do. because it's not out there. It's a wavelength. Now, we believe that everything we see is that. That's what it is. It's out there. People who believe that are known as naive realists by perception studies people. Okay? Now, let's go back to this wavelength thing. Let's go back to the electromagnetic spectrum. I argued, and I'd use the analogy, that imagine the electromagnetic spectrum is the Mississippi River. Starts in a small lake up in Minnesota, works its way down through the central of the United States and comes out in the Gulf of Mexico and meanders all the way down. Imagine that to be the electromagnetic spectrum. What you believe is the visual world that you believe is absolutely out there in a one-to-one relationship between what is out there and what you're seeing inside your head is about 1.5 inches, about 18 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. The rest we cannot see. The rest we cannot perceive. We perceive some of it as heat because, of course, it's infrared. We don't see ultraviolet, but bees can see ultraviolet. So perception itself is far more bizarre. So when you say seeing is believing, you've got to be very careful there because nobody really knows how vision works. They know the process. But then we have to even think, and who's the observer that's observing it inside your head? And that's an even bigger question, which we won't even visit. I visit this in other lectures and other books, but I haven't got the time to discuss it here. Okay, so this is how we see things. But what is really out there? Hilary Putnam, a very famous psychologist, in a book called Reason, Truth and History, wrote the following. Imagine that a human being, you can imagine this to be yourself, has been subjected to an operation by an evil scientist. The person's brain, your brain, has been removed from the body and placed in a vat of nutrients which keeps the brain alive. The nerve endings have been connected to a super scientific computer which causes the person whose brain it is to have the illusion that everything is perfectly normal. There seems to be people, objects, the sky, etc. But really all the person, you, is experiencing is the result of electronic impulses travelling from the computer to the nerve endings. Now think about that for a second. It's called the brain in a vat model. How do you actually know that anything is really out there? Your brain processes everything and presents it to you. Sight, sound, touch, everything is being recreated for you as a facsimile of that reality inside your head or somewhere. And of course, as I said earlier on, and we don't even know who you are that's doing the witnessing. So this is the idea again. So you've got the idea again at the brain in a vat. The brain in the vat is being convinced that they are they're on a boat rowing away. But they're not anywhere. They're a brain in a vat. They're not anywhere. Well, they are. They're in a vat. But they believe they're outside. Now, anybody who uses virtual reality, I'll give you an example of this. This is my Oculus VR headset. Okay? When I put that on, I can fire up a computer program. And when I put the headset on, and I put these on the end of my arms and inside my hands, these can sense where my fingers are. So in the computer game that I go into, I even see my hands moving as my real hands are moving. Okay? So I put the headset on. My hands I can see in front of me. My visual field is replaced. The external world is replaced by an internal world on the screen of the headset in stereo, and it surrounds me. It's all around me. I could be a brain in a vat in exactly the same way. Okay, and it's only recently with the creation of VR that we're really starting to understand just how peculiar perception is. Okay, we'll be returning to this later in terms of virtual reality. So the brain in the vat and Hilary Putnam. But the brain itself is an incredibly peculiar thing. And as I say to my readers, there are two things that you need to say to skeptics and materialist reductionists to have them running away. And I do it a lot. It's great fun because, you know, they're so pompous and they think they know it all, everything. You know, hubris is their middle name. Turn around to them and say, the hard problem of consciousness. No, there's three things, actually. The hard problem of consciousness, the observer problem, we'll be talking about that later, and the binding problem. Now, I'll guarantee some of you may know about the first two possibly, but it's unlikely, unless probably you are a psychologist, you probably don't know about the binding problem. And the binding problem is a huge, huge issue. You see a rolling ball in front of you. Okay? You see a rolling ball. Fine. But of course we know the rolling ball isn't actually out there at all, but you think it is. There's something magical going on with the visual system there because of this. As you see with this image here, the location of the ball in space is processed by one part of the brain, which is nowhere near the part of the brain that processes depth, which is nowhere near the part of the brain that creates motion or processes motion. Another part of the brain processes colour, and another one creates form. So all these parts of the brain are in all these processing areas inside your head are in completely different parts of the brain. Now, the brain cannot communicate instantaneously. In fact, electrical signals along the neurons are comparatively slow. And yet, they seem to be able to communicate instantaneously to give you the sensation of similarity, everything happening at the same moment. Okay? It seems to be as if the brain holds back information for you and then presents it to you when it has managed to process it all. Because all the binding problem issue would take a amount of time, which means that you're effectively, your visual system is already behind time. Now, I don't have a slide for this, but I will still mention this here, because it's a phenomenon that a lot of you will probably have experienced. The car door slamming. You're in an underground car park, and somebody slams a door in a distance away. Did you know that up to, I think it's 60 metres, you have a feeling of simultaneity? You see the door close and you hear the sound straight away. And yet you know that it has taken time for that sound to go from the door through the air at the speed of sound to your ears. Whereas light, travelling at 186,000 miles a second, reaches you much quicker. So there should be a gap between, a mismatch between you seeing the door slam shut and you hearing the sound. But there isn't. But after 60 metres, there is. And there's a video that you can watch on YouTube which shows this effect outside in the desert, where you see this point. So why is it not gradual? Why is it not, slowly you see it gets a bigger and bigger gap? It doesn't. It happens at that distance. This is again evidence that the brain buffers information. The brain is behind time. Okay. Now this is then where, I think if we're right, we then get to the phi experiment. Okay. Now the phi experiment is from the Greek letter phi. And what it is quite clever. It has two lights in different positions are flashed one after the other, as you see here. So that light is flashed there, and then that light is flashed there. Okay? And the idea is, though, that the light, as the lights flash on and off, we infill that information to seeing that. So what you see is a blue flash and then a red flash, and your brain sees that, and halfway along the brain has the flash turn from blue to red. Fine, no problem. However, as Kohlars and Grunhau, there was a philosopher who pointed this out to them because I don't think they'd realised it themselves, is that if you don't know what colour that is, when then do you think the colour will change? Now, logically, you'd assume it would be blue all the way along from there. It would be all the way along blue and then would become red at the end because you do not know what colour that is. It's an unknown factor. It's a piece of information that's already in your future. All people that do this test, even when they don't know what the other colour is, sees it change in the middle. Now think about this for a second. This is extraordinary. This means that your brain knows the future. It knows what colour it's going to change to. It either does that or the brain buffers information, which means that the brain is recording information. You can only buffer something when it's already been recorded, if that makes sense to you. You know, effectively you have to, if you're holding something back, there has to be something back. There's something you're holding back. And that is information. So the information is held back and then it's presented to your consciousness. And you see, either you see the future or you've already subliminally experienced it, but you don't know you've experienced it. And again, in other talks, I talk about this. It's a known fact that the brain does seem to be behind time, sometimes up to 6 seconds. Latest research has shown about 6 seconds. And again, if you want to see how a standard scientist takes this kind of information, go onto YouTube and look up a guy called Marcus de Satoy, who did a TV programme on the UK TV about 6 or 7 years ago on a science programme. I think it was Horizon, but you'll find it, Marcus de Satoy and time delay. Because he went to visit a German researcher in perception studies called Dylan Haynes. And Haynes showed him, using his brain being scanned, showed him how it's called the intention to flex. We already flex before we've made the decision. We think we're making a decision in the future, but we're not. Something else has already made that decision for us. Okay, but that's another area to go into if you're interested. Okay. So let's move on. So what could the explanations be here? Are we sitting behind time and we're recording it? Or is the future already part of our present understanding? Again, I wasn't intending to talk about it here, but I will talk about it now because I think it's important, even though I haven't got something on it. It's an experiment that was done in 1999, I think it was, by Dean Radin and an associate whose name will come to me in a second. And what they did was, you may not know, but the skin has conductance. And it gives off electrical signals. When you're nervous, it makes you sweat and it makes you react. There's a way of measuring this, which means that you can measure somebody's sense of nervousness or fear. And Dick Bierman was the other guy. It was Dean Radin and Dick Bierman. And what they did was they set up, they put the conductance sensors on somebody's skin. And then they showed them a series of photographs. And most of the photographs showed kittens and cloudscapes and everything else. And occasionally within them would be a car crash or something horrific. They were astounded to discover that a large number of people's skin conductance changed in anticipation of the next picture they were going to see, as if they'd already precognized the picture. Now, again, one of the researchers said this was rather similar to an upcoming film, Minority Report, the Tom Cruise adaptation of the Philip K. Dick novel or short story, in which you have precogs. And this is what the precogs were doing in that movie. And again, if anybody's interested, I've written a biography of Philip K. Dick, so I'm quite aware of Philip K. Dick's work. Now, what is happening there? Now, could it be that we can precognize our own future? Could it be there's a delay to information? Or could there be a simpler explanation? Something called the gambler's fallacy? The idea that, like you're playing cards or something and you're looking for a number 21 in cards to come. No, a better one is roulette, and you're playing on red and black, and the number of times that red comes up, you anticipate that the next time black must come up soon because there's been too many reds. Of course, there's still only 50-50 chance, but gamblers believe that, the more reds there are, we're getting into strange statistics. But it does mean that the more times that red comes up, the more you anticipate that black is going to come up. And could this be what happens with the people in the Bierman Radin experiment, whereby after a time of seeing cuddly kittens, they anticipate the fact the next one is bound to be horrible because I haven't had a horrible one for 5 cards or something? It's a possibility. It's a possibility, and one that needs to be addressed. So, what may be happening here? What solutions could be? Well, there could be the idea that the binding problem could be cured in 2 ways. The first one is that the brain communicates non-locally, and I haven't got time to talk about the physics or the quantum physics of non-locality, but it's a possibility, in which case it means that 2 subatomic particles, once they've been entangled with each other and been in the same system, however far apart they are, if you do 1 to 1, the other one reacts instantaneously over billions of miles, effectively. So there's some kind of communication that's going on there. Known fact, again, don't take my word for it, just look it up. It's a fact. Most scientists are in denial of it, but it's a fact. But the other argument is the idea that the brain works on holographic principles. Now, the first person that really experimented on memory was a guy called Carl Lashley. And Carl Lashley, over many, many years, did experiments with rats, very cruel, but what they did was they taught rats a way around a maze. And then they took the rat and they cut parts of its brain out. And the rat was still able to negotiate the maze. And with different rats, they cut different parts of the brain out. And they were never able to eradicate the memory and the learning, which led Lashley to believe that memory wasn't in the brain in some way. And of course, that's a logical conclusion, isn't it? If you can't eradicate the memory or the learning, why can't you? I mean, sometimes the rats would be slower, but he came to the conclusion that memory is stored in several parts of the brain at the same time. But if it's stored in several parts of the brain at the same time, we again get back to the binding problem. How do we get the instantaneous feeling of memory? Carl Pribram, Prince of Georgetown University. It was very sad, I swapped a couple of emails with Carl Pribram just before he died, and he was very fascinated about the angle I was taking in my early writing. This was before I managed to get a publishing deal, and it would have been wonderful had I had the opportunity to talk to him in greater detail about his ideas. Because Pribram was intrigued about what Lashley had done, and Pribram worked with Lashley. And he concluded that the only way you can really accommodate this is the idea that the brain works like a hologram. It's holographic. And it can communicate instantaneously because the parts are the same as its whole. Now, I'm being very precise when I say that the parts are the same as the whole, for one very good reason. Holograms are very, very peculiar things. Let's use an example. If you take a picture like this one here, and you take a bit of the picture out, you get just that bit, the image. Say this was an image of trees or something. You'd only get that corner of the picture and the trees. Okay? However, if you do that with a holographic image, you break the bit off, you don't end up with the bit of the image. You end up with the whole image in a slightly denuded way. Which means that the part is contained in the whole, and the whole is contained in the parts. Which suddenly means that if that's how the brain works, it can communicate holographically. Now, This is the idea that Pribram came up with, that the brain works under holographic principles, which would explain the speed of communication, it could explain the binding problem, and it could explain why it is that sometimes we can create, suddenly we'll think of something and spontaneously it comes into your mind. You know, I do this all the time. My brain is quite strange in the sense I can just recall information. I don't need to think about it. It's just there. Like it was with Dick Bierman earlier on. You know, it comes into my mind. It's like inside my head I have this whole Wikipedia and I can just instantaneously find the things I need. And generally with very talented people, it's called eidetic memory or sort of total memory in effect. And again, if anybody's interested in checking out my own podcast on YouTube, I recently interviewed a young lady called Rebecca, who is an Australian who remembers every single event in her life. And we tested her on on a live broadcast on Facebook Live because she is a great fan of Harry Potter. And we asked Rebecca, we didn't tell her we were going to do this, but I turned around to my assistant, Sarah, and I said, Sarah, have you, because she has a young daughter, have you got the Harry Potter books? Because Rebecca is a great fan of Harry Potter. And I got her to take out one of the books and I said, right, just select a page at random. And she selected a page at random. I said, now read it out and see if Rebecca can finish the sentence. She only read 4 words before Rebecca had continued the sentence, and Rebecca continued for the whole paragraph. Extraordinary. And that was on live radio. Now, there is no scientific explanation for that. You know, there's no explanation for this. And a future person that I'm going to have on my show is Diane Hennessy Powell, who's working with autistic people who seem to show precognitive abilities and telepathic abilities as well. This is the level I'm doing the science now. We are blowing the roof off this thing because I'm fed up with materialist reductionists just poo-pooing this and going for the easy targets, going for the woo-woo people, going for the people that think they're channeling from the planet Tharg. They're not the guys that are going to cause them problems. They know they're easy targets. People like myself and the people I'm working with are not easy targets, so they never engage with us. They're going to have to soon. But anyway, going back. So, holographic brains, the idea is, and again, a guy called Michael Talbot, who wrote a wonderful book on the holographic universe, is the book to read on this. But I'd like to think I've taken it a little bit further. But Talbot, I'm a great fan of Michael Talbot. But anyway, so the idea is the holographic brain, so the part is full of the whole. So it means, and effectively, as I said in one of my earlier books, it's the idea that within a teardrop is the Andromeda Galaxy in your eye. Now, the reason I say that is that there was another researcher who at the same time, this is the idea again, just very quickly, this is something I saw when I was did a talk in New York about 10 years ago, and I was trying to look for an analogy of how a hologram can work and how the whole can be the parts. And I went round the corner from the hotel I'd given the talk the night before, and I think it was the Pfizer building, and they had outside a series of montages like this of staff members made up of other staff members. And I thought it's a really good example of exactly how holography works, that the part is in the whole and the whole is in the part. Because ultimately, I argue, we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Something called pandeism, which again I won't be talking about in this talk, but maybe next year, if I'm invited back to do Contact in the Desert, I will do that. And I intend to discuss this in my forthcoming book, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. Okay, so here we have the idea of the holographic brain. But there's also the idea of a holographic universe. When Carl Pribram was doing his research, his son came across the writings of an American quantum physicist who'd worked with Oppenheimer, had worked with Einstein, who had fallen foul of the McCarthy witch trials and the witch hunts in the 1950s in America. And he'd left America because he was quite left-wing, and he ended up initially in Israel, I think, and then in Argentina, I think, and eventually made his way back to London, where he became a lecturer, I think, at Birkbeck College. A gentleman called David Bohm. Now, David Bohm had written one of the definitive books on quantum physics, on quantum mechanics, And he was a great follower of Einstein and everything else as well. But he also was very strong supporter of what's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. And we'll touch upon this a little bit later, the Copenhagen interpretation. But he was like Einstein. He believed that all this kind of weirdness that we're discovering in quantum physics, at a much deeper level of reality, sense prevails again. That at the moment what we're doing, we've only got half the picture. We haven't gone deep enough into reality. And he argued, and it's quite an interesting argument, that there are two orders. There's the implicate and explicate orders. And the implicate order is underneath everything. It's the kind of ground state of everything. The 0 point field, the Akashic field, the Akashic record, if you want to call it that. And the information in there emanates outwards into this and creates this universe, which is the explicate order. You know, it's explicate, it's there, it's obvious, it's around us. And as he said, ultimately, the entire universe, with all its particles, including those constituting human beings, the laboratories, observing instruments, etc., has to be understood as a single, undivided whole, in which analysis into separately and independently existent parts has no fundamental status. In other words, at a deeper level of reality, we are one singular thing. What we think as separation between particles, separations between bodies, separations between planets, is an illusion. And it's brought about because at a deeper level, it's a singularity. This is going very much to Eastern belief systems. And again, in my new book, I'm talking about Vedanta. I'm talking about the whole concepts of certain forms of Buddhism and everything else. This idea of a singularity, the concept in Hinduism of Brahman, for example. So David Bohm said at a lower level, there is this fundamental singularity, which is exactly the same as we talk about when we talk about holograms. So what does he really mean by the implicate and explicate orders? Well, he argued that if you take the smallest possible bit of space that we understand is something called the Planck length, okay, or if you wanted to put it in terms of area, the Planck square. Now, without going into detail, this is ridiculously tiny. It's everything stops at that point. You can't go any smaller. You cannot, okay? And that's related to something called Planck time, which is the amount of time it takes a light wave to go across the Planck length, okay? And they believe time stops there, and time is quantized. Time is not continual, it's in bits, just like we know the quantization of space. There's also the quantization of time. But Bohm argued that if we go as far down as we can in terms of size, and then calculate how many factors of size there are between how far we can go and how far we can possibly go, there's a huge area that we know nothing about in any way at all. Our instruments can't even go near touching it. And he argued that's where the implicate order functions. That's where it can be found. Now, what is particularly then intriguing about this is the universe itself holographic in its nature? Is the universe itself a hologram? Does that sound crazy? Well, maybe not. We'll return to this, but there's been evidence from something called the GEO 600 gravity wave detector in southern Germany, which suggests that we are starting to measure the quantization of space, and that space and reality is made up of tiny pixels. Pixels like on a television screen or on a computer screen. So suddenly we're starting to get into the area now of, well, what exactly is reality? And indeed, more importantly, if we apply David Bohm's ideas and Carl Pribram's ideas, is the brain a hologram processing a hologram? Now, I'll give one more example. I don't have a slide for this, but one of the examples that David Bohm gave to make people think about how at a lower level of reality everything is a singularity. And it was a wonderful example. And he said, imagine a scenario that we have come into communication through some magical purpose, intermediate communication, between an alien civilization and us. And we can communicate images to them magically, but we can't talk to them. But we want to give them an idea of what our world is like. And what they decide to do is to have an aquarium with one fish in it. And the decision is made that they will put one camera at the front of the aquarium and one camera at the side of the aquarium. And they'll send both signals from both cameras to the aliens. So the aliens receive the signal, and they have two television screens. One showing the fish from the side and one showing from the front. If you do that, it will seemingly to the aliens feel like there's two objects, there's two things there, because they're moving in different ways. At the same moment, they are moving in different ways, which is a question of perception, of where you're located as to whether you see which way they move. And they conclude that there are two fish in the tank. Until one of the aliens, let's call him, let's call him Bomi. And Bomi looks at it and says, hold on a minute. There's a relationship between the two. When one does one thing, the other one instantaneously reacts. So when the fish moves in that direction, the other one changes direction as well. So they're communicating instantaneously. Now this again is coming back to this spooky action at a distance that I touched upon, the idea of non-locality and the way subatomic particles, however far they are away, can instantaneously communicate. Now what Bohm said was, imagine that the two particles are like the fish. We see them as two particles because that's what our perception tells us. But at a deeper reality, they are but one fish. Now this would explain so much that's noticed in quantum physics. The idea of how spooky action at a distance, as Albert Einstein called it, can happen. It's the idea that they're not instantaneously communicating because our idea of distance and space is an illusion. Ernest Mach, who was a very famous German physicist, made the very good point, and it's very much part of German philosophy and going right back to Leibniz, the idea that what is space? Space is the container that contains everything. Everything happens in space. Planets are in space. The sun is in space. But just imagine if the whole universe was just the sun and the earth, and there was nothing else. And the sun went out. Where does the space go around the sun? Does the space just reduce down to the earth? Because space is by definition empty. Space by definition, according to original physics, there's nothing there. It's literally empty space. So if there are no objects in space, where does space go? And of course, this is again the idea that space is an illusion. Space is something we perceive in order for us to exist within this simulation that we exist within. And this is where we start moving on to now. So the findings of the GO 6600 was so profound that Craig Hogan, who's the director of Fermilab at the University of Chicago, and I think he's now moved. I think he's now located at a place in Canada. But he argued that this suspected that we're living in a giant cosmic hologram. Now, we've heard a lot talked about this recently, and I know that a lot of people have been going on about this quite recently, and I've been writing about it for a long, long time, and I've invested a great deal of my time to understand exactly what we mean by this holographic principle. It's something bandied around by people, but nobody bothers to actually explain to the layperson exactly why we believe it's a hologram And it's not just science fiction. It's based upon proper scientific facts. Okay? So Hogan is the guy that's doing the research. I think he's at the Perimeter Institute at the moment, which I think is in Ontario. But anyway, so this is the work that Hogan is doing. And I know that he had a setback. And I if anybody's out there who's aware of this, yes, I am aware of the fact that they didn't quite find what they were looking for when they were looking for the pixelation of space. But that doesn't mean they haven't failed. It's just they're possibly looking in the wrong place. So just to make that point. So it's all down to data. It's all down to information. Information is a term we use all the time. But information itself is interesting. What do we mean when we use the term information? Well, we know information can be shown in different ways. For example, we now know by using binary code in a computer, that is, that there's only two states on and off within a switch. But you can then apply that switch and actually put code into it by using binary code. So a 0 is no signal, a 1 is a signal. And then by doing that, you can write binary code, 1s and 0s. And of course, a lot of you will know that from the original images we had of the movie The Matrix. You know, the idea that it's digital in some way. But again, The Matrix never really explained. And I'm going to try and attempt to do that in the next half an hour or so. I'm going to try and attempt to explain why it is. I hope I'll succeed, but it's up to you to decide whether I do succeed. So the idea is, for instance, in binary number system, you can use combinations of 1s and 0s to represent characters. You know, so you put words and characters, and you can also then tell a computer screen for certain pixels to light up and everything else as well. So there is a way of conveying information by using minimal amounts. Now, in the 1940s and 1950s, there was a really big issue with understanding exactly what information was. And I think it was the Bell Telephone Company employed a guy called Claude Shannon to try and find ways of manipulating signals in telephone wires so that you could get more information going down the wires, because it cost money for the companies. And if they could find a way of bringing down information into its component parts, they could send more messages and therefore make more money. And Claude Shannon was the guy that first started researching the idea of exactly what we mean by information. And he came down to the conclusion, and it is nothing new here, that information is to do with entropy. It's to do with how much information you need to describe a system. For example, 2 glasses of water, a glass of ice chips, and a glass of water. Which is more disordered, the glass chips or the water? Of course, it's the glass chips, isn't it? Because there's so many angles and everything. Water is fairly easy to describe what water looks like, whereas glass chips are different. And this is getting to the idea of what information is. It's what you need to describe something. So I would need, in order to describe digitally the glass chips in a way that could be understood by a computer, I'd have to calculate every angle of every glass chip and everything else as well. Whereas the water is easier to explain. So the amount of entropy that's in the water is lower than the amount of entropy in the glass chips, because entropy is a measurement of disorder. Okay, so the more entropy, the more disorder. And this is how time works. Everything in time is moving from order to disorder. You know, if you, for example, I have an egg in my hand. It's very ordered. I drop it, I smash it, it becomes more disordered. There's more entropy in that system. Now, curiously, as an aside, one of the great mysteries is there's one area of time that seems to run opposite. So in other words, time is entropy. More entropy, we move through time. This is why our bodies get old. The older we get is because there's more disorder in our body as we get older. Things break down. Things decay. They become more complex. But evolution is the opposite. Evolution seems to run in the other way. And it's again something I'll be talking about in my new book, why that might be. Why it is that the evolution, the genetic code and everything else is moving towards more order, whereas everything else in the universe is getting more disordered. It's something, again, you will hear it used many on the heat death of the universe, the idea that the universe is running into this chaos of entropy and everything will just disappear into nothingness, really. So, again, the idea here is a solid, all the objects are less random. So all the atoms, or all the in terms of water, all the molecules of water consisting of oxygen and hydrogen are all ordered. So in water, in ice, I should say, they're incredibly ordered. So to describe that in terms of information, it has less entropy. It is comparatively straightforward to describe. When you add energy to the liquid, and it makes it, as the energy is put in, as heat or electromagnetic energy is put in, the atoms or the molecules start to move apart. They start to move apart, which creates a liquid. Okay. Then, when it gets hotter and there's more randomness in the system, it becomes a gas. And of course, in a gas, at least in a liquid, the particles are in contact with each other. In a gas, they're floating round, and it's completely random as to where any one particle would be. So in order to describe mathematically where anything is going to be, it becomes really difficult. So the amount of information you need to describe a condition of more entropy is greater. I hope I'm making sense here. So again, from this graphic, highly ordered, increase in entropy, more disordered. A ball with bits, that's been held together. Smash it on the ground, you've got more disorder. This is a measurement of the information needed to describe it. But things start to get strange when we start to talk about black holes. Because the universe is considered to be an enclosed system. And what we mean by an enclosed system is there's nothing outside of it. Now, any enclosed system has to have the same amount of entropy in it. Okay? It cannot be lost and cannot be gained. It's like energy, it can change, but it cannot be lost or cannot be gained. The same goes for information. In fact, recent research has shown that information actually has physicality. I go into that in one of my books. I haven't got time to do that now, but it is believed now that information has a physical presence to it. Now, a black hole, as you probably know, is one of black holes are the most mysterious objects in the universe. In effect, what they are is how do we describe this? That if a star implodes upon itself and folds in, a black hole is when it has shrunk to such an extent that there is no space left. Because in other words, if you reduce the human body down, you know that everything that's physical is 99.99999999996 empty space. Okay? That is every molecule, every atom is that. And within that space, what is actual matter in itself is vanishingly small, the quarks that make up things and the electrons. So it's vanishingly small, the amount of physical matter that actually exists. But that can be reduced down. So you push all of the quarks and all of the electrons and everything together in this great mass. Now, the greater the mass, the greater the gravitational pull. So, for instance, the Earth, as a large object, holds us to it because we are small objects with less mass, and we are attracted to something of greater mass, which is the planet. Nobody knows why gravity does that. By the way, it's there's the idea it's the curvature of space, but as I argue in my new book, well, what's space curving into? How can space curve into anything? They use the analogy of a mattress, don't they? You put a heavy object in a mattress and it sinks round it, and that explains gravity. Well, no, it doesn't, because the mattress is sinking into itself. It's sinking into something. Space cannot sink into anything other than more space, if that makes sense. But I'll be touching on that in the new book. So you have the the object slits down. Now imagine an object the size of a star being shrunk down to such an extent that all the mass is there, but as it shrinks, it gets more mass into it at a smaller space. Now, in order for an object to leave the Earth, to go into free orbit, it has to travel at approximately 24,000 miles an hour to get up and off the gravity and pull itself away from the gravitational force. So that's the escape velocity of the planet Earth. Imagine the escape velocity of an incredibly dense object. Suddenly you're talking millions of miles an hour, millions of miles a second. With a black hole, the escape, it's so dense, it's not like a neutron star, which is dense, but a black hole is far more than that. It effectively means the escape velocity is so high, it's greater than 186,000 miles a second, which is the speed of light, which means that even light cannot escape a black hole. Even light gets sucked into it, and that's why it's called a black hole. Literally, nothing can escape from it. Now, imagine that you're on a spaceship floating around a black hole. You're in the event horizon around the edge of it. And you take your laptop or your mobile phone and you throw the mobile phone into the black hole. Your mobile phone contains information. The universe is an enclosed system. So energy cannot be lost. Entropy can only be balanced. Where does that information go? If it goes into a black hole, it's supposedly destroyed. People like Stephen Hawking, for instance, argued this. But then he subsequently argued, well, no, there's mathematically evidence that black holes give off radiation. That radiation is the information that has been sucked in. It's the information about the stars and the planets and the civilizations and everything else that's been sucked into that black hole. The information that's inside the black hole is smeared around the edge of the black hole. It is as if when something falls into a black hole, it gets split into two. And the part that falls in, the information remains. Now, this is where things get curious. There's the idea. So there's the black hole. If you see here, there is the picture of a horse for some reason. The horse gets, when it's on the edge around the event horizon, it gets split into two. There is the one part of the horse that gets sucked in, but the information gets recorded and it sits on the event horizon. Now, and there again is the information being sucked down into a black hole. But what if this information is kept? And what if the information of everything is encoded? Now, this is going to take a little bit of an attempt to explain, but I will attempt to try and do it. And hopefully, because this is a recording, you can watch it again. And again, if anybody thinks I'm wrong on this, please tell me, because this is how I understand it to be. Remember, we haven't talked about the Big Bang, which wasn't big and wasn't a bang. And again, in my new book, I'll be discussing just how impossible the concept of the Big Bang was, because the Big Bang had to happen in time. And of course, the Big Bang created time. So how did the Big Bang have time to create time? But there you go. Again, I'll be discussing this in the new book. Emperor's New Clothes, I think I might call it. Also, the expansion of the universe, the first billionth of a second of the universe, in order to accommodate what we see out there, the scientists have come to this wonderful idea, which they call hyperinflation. So for a curiously, ridiculously small amount of time, the universe expanded thousands of times faster than the speed of light. How? We don't know. Where's the evidence of that? We don't know. But it makes what we see, accommodates what we witness. It's a bit like the law of large numbers trying to explain precognition. It's the same kind of thing. It's rather like Rudyard Kipling called, just so stories, how the elephant got its trunk. It's just so stories. So what I'm talking about here, has probably got more validity than the idea that suddenly the universe inflated massively. for some magical reason we don't know. And of course, where did everything come from? You know, every particle in the universe was supposedly in a point particle which had no extension in space. And this point particle just suddenly went boom, for some reason, not known why. It just decided to just go pow. Of course it did. Of course it did. So let's go back then to the idea of the Big Bang and everything expanding outwards. Imagine there's a Big Bang. So you've got, it's like a balloon. You know, imagine you're inflating a balloon. The balloon expands outwards. And it's been expanding out now for, 13.8 billion years. So what we are effectively are on the inside of a huge inflated balloon. Okay? So imagine the edge of the universe is like the inside edge of an inflated balloon. Now imagine the bits on the inside. And they argue that you could calculate how many Planck squares there are on the inside edge of the inflated universe. And if you calculate the amount of information, if you consider that each one of these Planck squares contained one bit of information, computer term, one bit of information, on or off, and that is then projecting information inwards from each of those, how many bits of information would be needed to describe the universe? Now, I have no way of knowing how they've done this calculation, but this is taken from a Scientific American article by Jacob Bekenstein. And apparently, the amount of information that can be encoded on the edge of the universe is exactly the amount of information that would be needed to describe the universe. And they say that that is such a significant coincidence to suggest that what is happening is we exist in a two-dimensional hologram. And it's a projection from these Planck squares on the edge of the universe. And it's to do with string theory, it's due to de Sitter space, it's due to an awful lot of quite technical stuff which is beyond my understanding. But suffice to say, it does seem to be evidence that that may be the case. Now, that is intriguing because it suggests then if we are created from information, what we think is physically real is not physically real. It is no more real than the computer screen you're looking at now or when you play a virtual reality computer game, because that's made up of pixels and digital information. But when you play a VR game, you have a sense of depth, you have a sense of an environment that you are existing within. There is a new thing that's just come out now, I think it's called Second Earth, is it? Or something like that, where they're literally recreating a second Earth in virtual reality, which is based upon this Earth, where you can buy space and locations and everything else as well. Why is that no different to this Earth? We are in very interesting times at the moment, and I've long argued that it's only now that ideas such as mine can be applied because the universe clearly is telling us this is how it works. It's not what it seems at all. We're about to hit another revolution in terms of scientific understanding. The cone theories, the idea of scientific revolutions, and the idea that our world now and our understanding of the universe there's got problems. It has got problems, and we'll touch upon this in a second. But the idea is this some form of simulation? And here is again the idea of how a hologram can project a two-dimensional universe, and we could be existing within a two-dimensional universe. So, as the Scientific American said, our innate perceptions that the world is three-dimensional could be an extraordinary illusion. And that was Jacob D. Bekenstein in 2003. Bekenstein, sadly no longer with us, but is one of the major researchers in terms of black holes and information theory. Stephen Hawking was very much into this. Stephen Hawking argued from this position as well. So, this is not crazy science. This is the leading edge science. So if as I say here, so if three-dimensional space is an illusion, so how can we ever be out of our body in two-dimensional space? You know, it doesn't work. There's something far more complex going on here. But of course there is. Because the universe out there is a mystery. And anybody who claims it isn't is lying. You know, I see time and time again the British physicist Brian Cox making glib, sweeping statements about people who believe in telepathy and people who believe in near-death experiences are complete plankers and idiots. And yet these are the things he knows about the universe. And he pretends that we know most of it. We don't. We haven't got a clue at all. Why don't we have a clue? Well, for instance, the universe. 74% of the universe is something called dark energy. 22% of the universe is something called dark matter. Why do we call them dark energy and dark matter? Well, the way doctors turn around and say a disease is idiopathic, that I have idiopathic epilepsy. You'll go, wow, he's done a diagnosis, I've got idiopathic epilepsy. Idiopathic means we haven't a bloody clue. And I'd like to use a new term, idiopathic science. Idiopathic science is we have no clue, but we pretend we do. And we give them names, and we give them beautiful Latin names, which would be even better. Like dark energy. Dark energy isn't dark because it's dark because we haven't got a bloody clue what it is. The same goes for dark matter. People talk about dark matter but don't explain why we believe that dark matter is there. We believe dark matter is there because galaxies revolve in the wrong way. Our maths and our science said they should revolve in one way, but they don't follow our maths and our science, and they revolve the other way, which suggests that there's more matter around the ring around a galaxy than we can see. So we call it dark matter. But clearly there's a lot out there we do not know, and we're surrounded by it. It's all around us. And of course the biggest mystery of all sits inside your head. What creates consciousness? The hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers said in 1999. We tend to pretend that doesn't happen either. How chance meetings of chemicals and electrical impulses in my brain create Anthony Peake. My hopes, my dreams, my anticipations, my dreams, my literal dreams. They've not got a clue. Not a clue. They just pretend they have. So, moving on then from here, so the mystery of dark matter. It does seem that there seems to be a link between the inside of the brain and the way the universe looks. Now, I'd argue quite rightly that just because something looks like something doesn't mean it is. But there has been a meme going round on Facebook over the last few days that's been stating that life and the universe and the neuron structures do look similar. And could the universe be a huge brain? Well, yes, it could. But it's not a physical brain in the way we understand it to be. It's an informational brain. So let's go on a bit for the simulation argument. If the universe is a hologram, or is a simulation, or a program, for want of a better term, because simulations, I never like using the term because it suggests something it's based upon. It's more complex than that. So what is the evidence for the idea that this is a simulation? Well, here we move on to something called Moore's law. Gordon Moore, I think it was in 1965, who the founder of Intel, said that the way in which computer programming and the way in which informational processing is happening within chips, they can get smaller and smaller, and they can process more information, contain more information. And they increase every I think it doubles every year or every 2 years or something. And Moore's law continued. Okay, and these are some examples of exactly how quickly our ability to hold data and information on microchips or whatever, is massive, and it's rocketing. We know this. We know this from our phones and how powerful our phone has more power than the computers that got man to the moon in 1969. I know from myself, I am amazed at the size of micro SD cards. You can get 500 gigabytes micro SD cards. 500 gigabytes. It's extraordinary, and something that's less size than your thumbnail. So it means that we can cram information in. And I think, and in one of my books I argued this, there's one great advance I think that's going to really blow everything off. More than quantum computing, which I'll be talking about in a minute, but the idea of using the computing capacity of DNA. Using DNA codons, the 4 codons of DNA, as a way of a kind of double binary system for encoding information. Encoding information within DNA, I think, is something we could do going forward. Okay, so how small can microcircuitry be? I came across this recently. So, we've now got transistors that are 1/100th of the size of a red blood cell. And they all have information. They can all process information. And of course, computers don't need, when we use the term computer, we don't necessarily mean a mechanistic computer. Anything that can be developed into a computer. Quantum computing, for instance, is an example of this. And I know that Google have developed a quantum computer at the moment. And quantum computing is the idea of using multiple universes to calculate things and entangling the information using the entanglement I was talking about earlier on. The computing power of these computers in the future will be extraordinary. The computing power available to our descendants will be unbelievable. And this is where we then move on. Because if our future selves may have computing power of such extraordinary power, what would they use that extraordinary power for? Well, Nick Bostrom, who is a mathematician at Cambridge, way back, I think, in the late 1990s, and he was one of the first guys to do this. He's Swedish, I think. And he suggested, if we apply Moore's law to a civilization 200 years in the future from us, and we know now that we have already been able to simulate in a computer a very tiny part of reality, why couldn't we simulate a whole universe? And as Nick Bostrom argues, there's only 2 or 3 arguments available to us. Humanity kills itself, wipes itself out in nuclear war. Or we survive, and if we survive and we have all this computing power, what would we do? And he said, almost no technologically mature civilization are interested in running consider the following 3 propositions. The chances that a species of our cultural level of development can avoid going extinct before becoming technologically mature is negligibly small. Almost no technologically mature civilizations are interested in running computer simulations of minds like ours. 3, you are almost certainly in a simulation. Each of these 3 propositions may be prima facie implausible, yet if the simulation argument is correct, at least one is true. And the first one, if we can avoid going out of existence, well, if we manage to do that, that's a possibility. And most technologically advanced civilizations are interested in creating simulations. As I just mentioned before, we have this second Earth thing at the moment going on. It is exactly what we want to do. We're preoccupied with virtual reality. At the moment, I'm playing a virtual reality version of a game I played in the 1990s called Myst, where I'm in a virtual reality Myst island. These are things that we can do. You put your Oculus headset on and you go into some of these interactive social media sites where people have avatars and they can come over and speak to you and you can walk around you, and it could be somebody in Japan that's communicating with you as if you were in a sharing three-dimensional space with them in a 2-dimensional screen environment. Okay? So So the idea as well is, and one of the biggest problems of the idea of simulating a simulated reality is something called a substrate problem. And the substrate is an interesting one. It's the idea, if I was able to scan your brain down to the molecular level, in fact to the subparticle level, and then upload all that data into a supercomputer, is it you? And that's a fascinating question, because it is you in the sense that it's a facsimile of you, but A, would it be alive? B, would it be able to access your thoughts and fears and dreams? And if it is, it means technically we could become all immortal. And we could be living in a simulation created by our distant descendants that have simulated us in order to watch what we do and see what we do. So that's one option. And I think it's a fascinating idea and possibly an interesting argument. But under certain circumstances, we can access information from outside of time and space. In other words, if there's a simulation, can we access information from outside of it? And the thing is how we understand time, this idea of time. And I'm reverting back now to the idea, if it's a simulation, it would mean that everything has been simulated. The past, the present, and the future. Okay, it's not just the present moment that is simulated, is it? Because we know when you play a third-person computer game, every event that you and every choice you can make in that game is already on the CD-ROM, it is already in the game. It's already existent. It's just you have not experienced it. You have not, to use a technical term, collapsed the wave function of that reality. Okay? So let's move on from this, because this is a little bit about time and how time works. And it's to do with block time. We tend to perceive time in split seconds. It's a game that most people play. What is the present moment? How long is now? It's a famous rock song. But how long is now? What is now? What is the instant? And we perceive reality in bits of 1/24th of a second. Our brain processes it in that way, and our visual systems process in that way. But that's not a universal. Why should it be 1/24th of a second? Imagine a being that can perceive its critical fusion facility, which is the thing that we see movement within the eye. Imagine it's 1 year. In which case, how would a creature that every instant is 1 year would perceive the planet Earth? The planet Earth would look like, and the moon would look like that, wouldn't it? In fact, that would be, 1 month. Every loop of the moon would be 1 month. And 1 year, the Earth would be like a hula hoop going round the sun. And it would be solid. As far as that creature was concerned, it would be solid. And on the surface of that planet, to around about 10 feet, maybe 20 feet, would be this biomass. Because if you take a time-lapse photograph of somebody walking across a room, or a group of people, within seconds, the bodies all merge into each other. They become a singularity. They become a singular thing. And is this again coming back to the idea of the way in which everything is enfolded in itself? Could it be it's to do with time and our perception of time? Just one thing, by the way, again, which I forgot to mention before in the simulation argument. There's one point I'll be making in my new book that, to me, if I ever wanted evidence that this is a simulation and what is proof of it, it's the moon. Don't you find it absolutely extraordinary that the moon is 800 times smaller than the visible disk of the sun, and the sun is 800 times further away from the Earth than the moon? So when we have an eclipse, a full eclipse of the moon, or the sun to perfection covers the sun. Is that not the most extraordinary chance you can ever imagine? And yet we see this, and we've been seeing it for centuries, and scientists never think, do you know what, that's really weird? Have you ever heard any scientists say that? No, because they don't see it. They just think, oh, it's chance. And the interesting thing is that ratio has only been while observers, i.e. observing consciousnesses, have been on planet Earth. What does that tell you? Well, I don't know quite what it tells us, but it says something's not quite right. Because you look at every other planet that has satellites in the solar system, the ratio between the size of the Earth and the Moon is extraordinary. It's much bigger than most other satellites. Why? In relation to its main planet. Why? Well, because of that. And if I ever wanted to say, what's proof of the creators of the simulation just saying, I'll give you that little cube, but you won't even see it. Just thing to think about. Okay, so then we have the planet Earth going round and the Moon going round, and that's the idea. And again, it's the idea of block universes. And the idea of block universes was actually put forward initially by Hermann Minkowski, who was Einstein's teacher, which is again intriguing. The idea that the universe in some way, we need to extend it out because time is not what it seems. And this is where we're going to be going now with the talk. I'll now be coming on to what time really is. Okay, do you remember the movie, the Interstellar? Amazing movie. And of course, in Interstellar, for instance, it gave some examples in Interstellar that I've used in previous books of mine, like the idea that the greater the gravitational pull, the greater time slows down. And again, that is true, because if you recall, when Coop and his associates are on the planet with the great gravitational pull, time is completely different for them to the people in the spaceship above. Okay, and this is again something that has always intrigued me, the idea that your feet are actually older than your head because of the gravitational pull of your feet and how the gravitational pull works on your feet, which means that if you were on the sun, time would be different. From the point of view of the sun is in a different time zone to the Earth and to galaxies and everything else as well. We're all in different times. Again, in my new book, I'm going to be talking about this in terms of how time is relative to your viewpoint. And this is not the same as Einstein. This is a new theory that's coming up, which is quite extraordinary. Okay, so the Tesseract sequence and everything else was one of the famous sequences. Remember where Coop looks through a bookcase and sees his daughter, and he pushes the book through to try and signal to her, because he's in the fifth dimension. You know, there's the four dimensions of space and time, and then there's the fifth dimension, which is outside of time. And Christopher Nolan wanted to get across what time was like, and he used what he calls the Tesseract sequence. Now, a Tesseract is a hypercube. But simply, you have a point, okay? Then you draw a line of points and you have a line. Then if you draw right angles from them, you go up and you create a square. And then you draw right angles from the four corners and you end up with a cube. If you then draw lines from all the points of that cube, you create what's called a tesseract, a hypercube. And he's trying to explain that's how our perceptions work. We're existing within the cube, but there is existence within the tesseract, which is outside of time. And when Coop looks through at his daughter's life, he sees her life as a singularity. He sees her life in its entirety. It's what the Hindus call the linga sarya, the long body. The idea of you are all your lives. You're not just this moment now, you're a slice in time, but you are everything from the moment of your birth to the moment of your death. And again, if you could see yourself from the viewpoint of a creature whose critical fusion facility was 75 years, you're this long worm-like creature that kind of is small, gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then sort of decreases slightly and disappears again. That's what you'd look like to a creature that sees the world in that way. A creature that's looking at you from the fifth dimension, looking into time and space-time. So that's what is happening in the Tesseract sequence. Now, this is quite important, and it's important for one reason, because we're now moving into the cheating the ferryman section. We've had 1 hour 48, and I'm going to continue now because we're going to be moving on, and I'm on a roll, and I want to continue with this. So if there is no time, this means that everything that will happen and can happen is stored in a timeless place, doesn't it? If this is a program, if this is some kind of simulation, the information needed to explain future events and past events has to be encoded somewhere. It has to have a hard drive that it exists on. That hard drive is known as the 0 point field, or what mystics have called the Akashic field. 0 point energy is a form of energy that's found where there shouldn't be any energy at all. It's found just above absolute zero. And it's a place where there should be no energy, because at absolute zero everything stops. There is no energy available. But they're discovering, when they take helium-4, I think it is, down to just above absolute zero, there's still energy coming up from somewhere. So it means that the actual vacuum of space is not a vacuum. You know, I mentioned before about space being empty. It's not. It's full of virtual particles that pop in and out of existence. And again, this is quantum physics. You know, just check it up in a quantum physics book. Look up virtual particles. They're particles that don't exist, then do, and then disappear again. Where they come from, where they go back to, they don't seem to care. But we can't explain those. As they used to say, just shut up and calculate, which is what when quantum physicists and students used to turn around and say, I just don't understand this. They were just told, well, just shut up and calculate. Don't look at the implications of it, just calculate. We don't know why it works, we don't know how it works, it just does. Okay. So there's the 0 point field where the energy is coming from. And it suggests that it can hold information. And again, what I'd suggest, if you're interested in this, my associate, I wrote a book with him a few years ago called The Immortal Mind, is Professor Irving Laszlo, who's written a series of books, and his book on science in the Akashic field is an extraordinary piece of work. And he says the Akashic field is the enduring record of all that happens and has ever happened in the whole entire universe. Everything is encoded. There is no time. Everything is a present moment. And again, if anybody's interested, the writings of somebody called Julian Barber, where he has a concept called Platonia, which I'll be talking about in great detail in my new book. It's very, very interesting. I've touched upon Barber's work earlier, but I really am now seeing how Barber's work fits in with everything, what Barber's ideas really mean. So the idea is that there is a record. So, and what is the portal by which we can access the Akashic record? Now we're starting to get into some interesting areas. There's a concept called Kekara Mudra, which yogis use in India and everything else as well. And what it consists of is placing the tongue at the back of the throat. And they train themselves to lift their tongue up and go to the back of the throat. The reason they do that is that when they do that, when they're trained, they get a taste at the back of the throat. The immortal liquor, the nectar of the moon. And as somebody said, as the Hathagaya Pradipika, the Indian yoga book, immortal liquor is the nectar exuding from the moon. It is produced by the fire which is generated by inserting the tongue into the nasopharyngeal cavity. Now the moon, they think in terms of this, is the pineal gland. So what they do is they place it at the back and they get this taste. And this taste then puts them into altered states of consciousness. I'm interested as to what that taste is. What are they tasting? What is going on here? Okay, I'll explain before I move on that, because I did this in one of my books. At the 49th day of gestation, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland are a single body called the epiphysis. And that sits at the back of the throat. Now note the time, 49th day of gestation. That is when the Hindus and the Buddhists believe the soul enters the body. So that in terms is an interesting coincidence. At that point, the epiphysis goes up the back of the throat and carries up and moves into the centre of the brain, where it splits into two, where it splits into the pituitary and the pineal bodies. It leaves a very thin cleft that goes down to the back of the throat called Rathke's pouch. I believe that the immortal liquor, or the nectar, or the ambrosia, or whatever people call it, is because there is a liquid that is dripping down from the pineal gland into the back of the throat. The question is, what is that liquid? Well, it has been believed for centuries that there's something mysterious about the pineal gland. There are various things, and I show it here, of various pictures of how the pineal gland is of interest to people. Now, it could simply be it's one of the few things within the brain that is not two of them. So if you opened up my skull now, I'd rather you didn't, but if you did, you'd find two hemispheres. Pull the two hemispheres apart and you'll find the pineal gland between the two of them, right in the middle of the brain. Why? Why does it sit on its own? Why is it that the pineal gland actually there's only one organ in the body that uses less blood than the pineal gland, and that's the liver. Why? What's its function? Well, one of the known functions of it is to create a substance called melatonin. And it's because, remember I was talking before about the way in which the signals go through your eyes, through the optic nerve, and I used a term called the optic chiasma. The optic chiasma is where the two optic nerves from the right and left eye cross to feed the different parts of the other side of the brain. Directly above where they cross is where the pineal gland is located. Why? The pineal gland can sense light. It's an ossified eye. You know, we talk about the third eye. In fact, there's an animal called the tutora, which is a lizard that is found off the coast of New Zealand. Its third eye is in the centre of its forehead. Okay? The Ajna chakra. Okay? Like we call the Ajna chakra. It's there because it needs to know whether your eyes are perceiving light or not. It needs to know it's dark. Now, those of you who've seen my original presentation that I did in terms of my lecture will know I talked about darkness and what's the symbol of darkness and why is it that shamans and people are trained in the dark? How is it that we have entity encounters involved in darkness? This is how it's all going to come together now. The light, when it goes along, when it starts to go dark, the pineal gland senses it's going dark because it has crystals inside it. It's called pineal sand, and these crystals recognize the fact that it's going dark. They then start to synthesize a substance called melatonin, which is the substance that makes you go to sleep. So it literally is there to make you go to sleep. But there's something curious about melatonin because it is very close in its structure, the structure of its molecule, to another substance called dimethyltryptamine. Okay? So, what do we know about dimethyltryptamine? Well, we know it's one of the most powerful hallucinogenic substances known to man. We know that it is in the spinocerebral fluid. We know it's found in the liver. And comparatively recent, in 2017, a researcher called Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan, together with her team, doing experiments on live rats, discovered dimethyltryptamine in the pineal glands of live rats. This is the first time that it has been discovered that dimethyltryptamine is in the brain. Because the question is, how did it get there? Now, I'd argue it got there because it was synthesized from melatonin. And there are people I know that are working on the synthesis of how this may occur. We know that within the brain there are things called the trace amine-associated receptors within the brain who seem to have been designed to work with dimethyltryptamine. Now, why would receptor sites in the brain, within the neurons of the brain, evolve for no reason? They wouldn't. They're there for a purpose. They're there to work with dimethyltryptamine. Okay? Rick Strassman, as I said in my previous lecture, once suggested that dimethyltryptamine was our reality modulator. It is what stimulates what's out there, what we think is out there. It's not out there at all. It is, and again, I've not touched upon perception studies or anything else, but believe me, don't be a naive realist and think that what's out there is what really is out there. Whatever is out there, it's probably holographic, as I've said before. It's probably in many ways you see it as it really is. And in one of my earlier books, I argued that in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I gave evidence for certain individuals who are along what I call my Huxleyan spectrum, which their doors of perception are wider open, which means that the attenuating device, the device that stops us really seeing the universe as it really is affected and is opened. So people who have classic migraine, people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, people who experience schizophrenia. With schizophrenics, what is happening is that the real world is coming through to such an extent they can't handle it. They literally cannot handle the information that's coming through. Autism is a classic example. I think autism is linked. I think Alzheimer's is linked. I think they're all linked. And in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I do the linkages for you. So you can read that book if you want, and maybe invite me back next year to do a talk on that. But suffice to say, so if dimethyltryptamine is active in the brain, and there's still a big argument to say whether it is or whether it isn't, but let's argue for argument's sake that it is. When is it really active? Well, there is arguments to say that children, when they're born, are born definitely having an epileptic seizure. And it seems that when we get to death, we die having an epileptic seizure. And as Emile Goncourt, one of the Goncourt brothers, who was a famous temporal lobe epileptic, said, what is life? Life is nothing between two epileptic seizures. And I thought that was such a profound statement. The idea we're born in a seizure and we die in a seizure. And what is taking place within the seizure, I believe it is a release of dimethyltryptamine within the brain. Now we're starting to get to cheating the ferryman. You're going to like this, lads. You're going to like this. When the pineal gland releases dimethyltryptamine. Okay, now cheating the ferryman. We've had 2 hours, and now we're about to get to the nub of the matter. Evidence for your immortality. The ancient Greeks, when somebody died, they would place a coin called an obolos or an oboli underneath the tongue of the corpse. Or sometimes they'd place 2 oboli on the eyes of the corpse. The reason for that was when the person died, they would find themselves a shade. Now, a shade is a ghost figure. And they'd find themselves on the edge of a river. People tend to call it the river Styx, but it's also technically known as the Acheron. And through the mists would come Charon the boatman. And Charon would come over, and they would pay Charon with the oboli. They'd pay Charon, and Charon would take them back over to the land of the dead. But when they were over in the land of the dead, according to ancient Greek myths, and again, if anybody's seen my previous talk, I talk about Plato's cave and everything else. These are all the same group of people that created Plato's cave and the ideas of the Eleusinian mysteries and everything else as well. So there's linkages here, which then moves into Gnosticism and everything else. So there's a linkage here historically and scientifically and neurologically. The power of this model is extraordinary. I just find it amazing that maybe people will get it now when I've done it fully, like in this talk, okay? So the legend was that when you got there, you were given a choice. You could either stay in the land of the dead and go forward wherever you wanted to go, and whichever your belief system is, be reincarnated, whatever you wanted to do, you could do whatever you wanted. Or you could stay in the land of the dead, and spend ever in the Elysian fields. Or you could choose to drink the waters of the river Lethe. The Lethe is known as the river of forgetting. And what you do is you drink the waters of the Lethe, and all your past memories of being you, your ego in effect, and your ego memories would be washed away, and you would become totally forgotten in a state of what Plato called amnesis. Technical term from ancient Greece. It's a state of amnesis. When you're in a state of amnesis, you were allowed to go back across the river and effectively cheat the ferryman. That's my term, not the ancient Greeks, but cheat the ferryman of his payment, because he has to take you back. And he takes you back, and you get reborn again. But you don't get reincarnated. This is not the point of cheating the ferryman. In cheating the ferryman, you get reborn as yourself. Now, think about this for a second. We have been labouring in great detail about this being a simulation, and the way in which somebody in the future or wherever has created a simulation of us. What if the simulation is a simulation of your life? What if the simulation is a simulation that contains, like a computer game does, the outcome of every decision you make is already encoded there and can be viewed from the fifth dimension, can be viewed from the Tesseract, and every outcome is already there. You just follow one route or another, depending upon which route you want to go. Hold that in your mind as we progress. This is the cheating the Ferryman process. Okay? Here's a skydiver. It's a very sad skydiver because he's actually forgotten his parachute. Now, this is quite important because in near-death experiences, there's something called a panoramic life review. And I've written extensively about this and will continue to write extensively about this, which was first put forward by a guy called Albert Heim, who was a Swiss mountaineer. And he interviewed a number of people who had survived mountaineers falling off cliff faces. And nearly all of them had had near-death experience. Nearly all of them had had panoramic life reviews where they saw their whole life flash before their eyes. Okay? Bear that in mind as we continue forward. By the way, Albert Heim was the teacher of Albert Einstein's teacher. So there's a nice link here in many ways. So, he's forgotten his parachute and he starts to fall. Now, there's a point where he's going to get close to hitting the ground. In near-death experience parlance, there is things called the Grayson scale or the Moody traits. And I've mentioned one of them already, the panoramic life review. But there's another one, which is even more important. And it's the one where they turn round and they say that time slowed down or time seemed to stop. Neurologically, I argue that is brought about. I originally argued it was to do with the release of a substance called glutamate. Now, the reason I thought it was glutamate was that glutamate is in its effect very, very similar to a substance called ketamine. And a guy called Carl Janssen of the Maudsley Hospital many years ago wrote a paper drawing parallels between the near-death experience and ketamine experiences, and argued that it was because of the glutamate, and in fact, in ketamine experiences, and because glutamate and ketamine are very similar, this is what was taking place. And in fact, he particularly was interested in the panoramic life review, and he was particularly interested in the slowing down of time as this happens. Now, many of you will know, probably have experienced this. When you're given bad news, time seems to slow down. When you're involved in a car crash, time slows down. When you fall, time slows down. This is because time perception is subjective. Time does not exist out there. Time is again to do with our perceptions. We confuse time with entropy, the thing I was talking about before. But time isn't entropy, they're different things. Time is different because time is the only thing that's measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples. You can only have a minute of a minute. And you can't objectively say that my minute is different to your minute. You can't tell because my minute is subjective. As Henri Bergson, the great French philosopher, argued, there are two types of time. There's long and durée, the idea of duration. So I'd argue that time is internal to you. And if time is eternal to you, it means that you never get to the point of dying. You're already drinking the waters of the Lethe as you approach death. And suddenly time expands outwards. Subjective time, how you perceive time changes. Somebody watching this guy, he hits the ground and he dies. But from his point of view, he never gets there. Now, I'm going to be doing again the maths of this because I've come across a new concept that I wasn't aware of when I wrote my previous books, which will be in my new book, but I'm going to hold that one back because I've really got the proof now that I really needed mathematically. So this is the first time I've announced this, but I've got the proof mathematically now that my argument does work. And the idea is that every microsecond for him, the next microsecond is twice as long. And the next microsecond is twice as long again. So you can see that from originally, the bisection paradox of Zeno, that he never gets to the ground. He never hits the ground. He never gets to the point of death. But from somebody witnessing him, smash, he's dead. But he's already in a different time to the witness. He's already immortal. Okay? He's already in a different time. So what happens at that point? DMT release. DMT is released. And it's released, I would argue, in a way that floods the whole brain, or it just, wherever consciousness is coming into the brain, because I don't believe consciousness is in the brain at all. It affects the nodal point where consciousness is interfacing with the simulation. So when people turn around and say, well, there's not enough time in normal time for that brain to be flooded. Well, there is if there's one interface between what we really are and what we are inside our head. It is in to do it. So then DMT is released and it slows down. Each second takes twice as long to pass as the one before. It then draws up the information from the 0 point field via the microtubules. Now, it's something I haven't talked about. It's called orchestrated objective reduction. And it's an idea from Sir Roger Penrose, who recently was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics, and his associate professor, Stuart Hamerhoff, of the University of Arizona, who's a consultant anesthesiologist. And the two of them have come up with a model that's it's synergous with mine. It links with mine in many, many ways. And it's to do with the microtubules in the brain, which many of you may recall I mentioned when I did my last talk when I was talking about Alzheimer's. And again, it's linked to this, okay? But the information is drawn up. It's almost as if the 0 point field is the hard drive containing the information of your life, of your computer game. And as subjective time perception increases exponentially, the past life recordings are projected into your consciousness. The model of your life, containing all the outcomes of all the decisions, are then projected into your mind, and you start to live your life again. Now, I argue at the point of death, when it's your first life, because remember, at the end of the second life, it happens again and again and again and again. That's important. It's like Groundhog Day. Connors lives in the movie Groundhog Day. Connor lives the same day over and over again. You live the same life over and over again. And the Russian edition of my book was actually called Groundhog Life, which I thought was quite good. Okay. So, at the point of death, I'm now introducing a new element of my theory. It's called the Damon-Edolon dyad. And in my book, A Damon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, I discuss this. Consciousness splits. Up until that point, we think we're a unitary being. We're not, we're two. We always have been two. There are two of us in our head. They're both you. But at the point of death, the first time, in the virgin life death, the daemon splits off. And the daemon suddenly sees your life in a totally different way. The daemon sees your life from the point of view of Coop in Interstellar. He sees it from the Linga Surya viewpoint, the long body. He knows, or it knows, or she knows, because I think there's certain evidence to assume that if you are male, your daemon will be female, and vice versa. It does seem to be that. I'm not quite sure. I need to investigate that more. Of course, you'll know the term daemon from the Philip Pullman books, his Dark Materials. It's the same concept, but he uses it in a different way. But it's the same concept, the idea of your higher self, the part of you that is part of you. It's again from ancient Greek belief systems, it's from Gnosticism, and it's from the Eleusinian mysteries. So again, there's nothing new. I'm talking about the daemon here. Socrates had a daemon. Rudyard Kipling had a daemon. These daemons are known. It's a term that has been used for centuries, okay? But it's never been explained before, and that's the difference. I'm the only person that's ever put an explanation to this. In fact, I'm the only person that's ever put an explanation to the near-death experience in this way. Okay, so this is important. This is uniquely to me. Okay, So the consciousness splits into two. The daemon suddenly realizes what it has to do. It's your game player on your game of life. So it sees it as the linga surya, but the Edolon sees life linearly. Linear time, read in sequence. So you perceive your life in sequence, whereas the daemon is outside of time and sees your whole life through the viewpoint of the long body. Again, in one of my books, I discuss the writings of J.B. Priestley, and I particularly talk about some of his plays, including one of his plays called Time and the Conways. And in Time and the Conways, one of the characters, Alan, describes literally this, the idea of the long body. Check Priestley out, he was an amazing guy. Or check out some of my lectures on Priestley if you want, or buy my book on Priestley, which might be even more interesting. So that's what happens when we cheat the ferryman. So you're catapulted into a game of your life from the moment of your birth. But there is a game player this time. And the game player is your daemon. You know, when you play these games and you watch somebody on a computer game, you switch on. In my generation, it was things like Lara Croft and Tomb Raider. So you open up the game for the first time, and you have on the on-screen sprite. The on-screen sprite is literally an Edolon. The on-screen sprite, if it had any form of self-referential knowledge, it would know nothing. It would be suffering from what Plato called amnesis. It's forgotten who it is. It's born for the first time, even though it's a second life, because, of course, the daemon has already lived one life, and the Edolon has split off from it, and it realises what it has to do. So it realises, I've got to get this on-screen baby, child, embryo or whatever, through its life. And then it thinks, well, what do I remember from last time? Oh, shoot, well... And that's when you do a computer game, don't you? The first time you play it, your on-screen sprite, you have it run down a corridor, and it goes into a room, and a big monster in there. And it gets killed. It's dead. Edolon's dead. It's gone. Damon isn't, though. The daemon is still alive and the game player. So it starts a new game. It starts a new life. New Edolon comes out. Doesn't remember anything about the previous life, because Edolons don't, as a matter of course. And it starts to live its life again. And this time, because we're assuming that the Edolon on the on-screen sprite has some form of self-referential knowledge about it just being itself. And it's running along the corridor. And it goes and suddenly it goes, oh, I don't want to go in that room. I don't know why, but there's something telling me I shouldn't do it. And that's the gameplay, that's the daemon. But the problem is the daemon doesn't know how to communicate. The game analogy only works so far, because the daemon, the channels of communication aren't completely open. In fact, they're mostly closed. For most of us, the Damon-Edolon communication channels are broken. They can't get through. It can get through in dreams. It can try and warn you in dreams and say, for God's sake, don't do this. Or it'll try and warn you in inklings, the feeling that something's not quite right. Or it'll warn you by telling you that this person is going to be important to you. So it kind of gets messages through. But it depends on how open your doors of perception are as to how effective the daemon is in your life. Now, there will be times when, although daemon consciousness is not there all the time, there are times when the waters of the Lethe don't quite work, and you'll be somewhere and you'll go, I've done this before. It's deja vu. There are 72 different explanations for deja vu in a recent book that came out. I think it was published by, I can't remember who actually wrote it now. But there are 72. Mine is one of them. Okay? And this is one of them. They can't all be right. Most of the major people will mostly cite the Efron thesis from 1962 by a guy called Robert Efron, which is called the visual pathways theory. And again, I remember I mentioned about the way in which we have two pathways in the brain and the optic chiasma. The idea is the visual pathways feed the right or left hemisphere, the dominant or non-dominant hemispheres of the brain, who have their own visual cortices and everything else as well. And the idea is that the visual system sees something a split second, there's a delay in communication, and you see one thing and you see it again. And that apparently explains déjà vu. It doesn't explain precognitive déjà vus in any shape or form. And a large number of déjà vus are precognitive. So that's out the water. But it's out the water anyway, because a guy called Akira O'Connor at the University of Leeds many years ago discovered something called déjà senti, which is already heard, because people who are born congenitally blind have a déjà sound where they hear something and hear it again. And that's not possible because the visual pathways theory cannot explain that in any shape or form. So that's out the water. So when people turn round to you that are so-called knowledgeable and go, oh, Efron thesis, no visual pathways, total rubbish. You can now tell them that that's been disproved, and then send them to me if you want. Okay. So the idea is then that sometimes you'll get an inkling, and that's a déjà vu. We now can come back almost to the start of the lecture or the workshop, because also this could explain why so many people quasi-remembered 9/11. It's because it was the most traumatic event in our recent history. So therefore it is not at all surprising that we have deep down access memories, deep memories. We don't know where from. And of course, the definition of déjà vu is not déjà vu over and over again. If you do something, you do it again, you think it's déjà vu. No, that's not. It's quite the opposite. The definition is it's a memory from an unknown part of your past. So you don't remember the last time that you did it. So it's quite the opposite of what people say in terms of that. You don't know when you remember it. And that's, I think, what is happening with people who precognize 9/11. And I think this is what happens with people who precognize things generally. There's a breakdown in the communication channels are open suddenly, or open in some way to the daemon. And in my Damon-Edolon dyad model, I do models of how, again, from my Huxleyan spectrum, how the daemon can be more active in somebody's life depending upon their neurological makeup. And I argue this is why possibly people who experience schizophrenia hear voices in their heads. I think it's possibly the daemon and possibly communications there. I don't know. I need to know more of the neurology of that. But suffice to say, it seems to work as an explanator for experiences. I think all of this, cheating the Ferryman hypothesis, explains so much, which no other theory or no other hypothesis I know does to this extent. I can explain virtually every extraordinary experience. And in my later books, when I apply this to the out-of-body experience as well, I apply it to lucid dreaming, I can apply it to an awful lot. And the new book will be applying all of this as an uber hypothesis, as it were. So you play the game. And of course, the daemon then gets you through the game until there's a point where the daemon can't protect you. Possibly because the daemon has not experienced it before. And it's new to the daemon as well. And is this why déjà vu experiences drop off as we get older? Because it's a known fact, that it's been researched this, that the older you get, the less déjà vu experiences you get, to an extent. And that's clearly because if you apply cheating the ferryman to it, it's obvious why. It's because as you get older, the chances of you getting through to the last end of your game point is more likely. So you've survived longer. But from that point onwards, it's a new game, as it is in a normal game for the game player. It's new. So your daemon cannot help you. The daemon can guide you, but the daemon can't help through prior knowledge. Okay? Now, people have said to me, so why does the daemon allow us sometimes to make terrible mistakes? It's because it's planning things. You have to go through this in order to get to a point the daemon wants to get you at. So you need to have that bad relationship in order to get to the point the daemon wants you to be when you meet the right person. Because if you hadn't had that bad relationship, you wouldn't be in the position psychologically to meet the right person. And I argue this is how life works. The daemon's projecting into the future to make sure that its on-screen sprite can get to where it wants it to be. Then you'll have daemons that will turn around and think, do you know what? I'd like to take a completely different route this time. I'm going to take my Eidolon off on a completely different route. I'm going to have it emigrate to Australia. I'm going to follow that route. I'm going to follow that part of the program. And I also believe that the Akashic field and Akashic record is not just a record of your life. As we know, it's a record of everybody's lives. But because I argue we are one singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, you don't even have to live your own life within cheating the ferryman. You can, if you want, your daemon, having lived many lives in the in-between lives, might decide, do you know what I want to do now? I want to be reborn as somebody else. I want to live in the Victorian period. I want to be Alfred the Great. And is this when people have past life regressions? Is what is taking place? Though within the greater Uber daemon world, where all the records are, and you can flick between them, but you have to go through your own cheating the ferryman experience of many lives, like Connors does, before you're allowed to move on to try the other lives and the other places. On top of that, you can experience, for instance, there could be records where your parents didn't decided to emigrate to Australia. Like my parents were about to emigrate to Tasmania, but because my grandmother was ill, I never got to Tasmania. But there will be a record somewhere within the Akashic field of the outcome of what happened when my parents went to Australia and had me born there. And I'd have had a totally different life, met different people and everything else. Now, isn't this exciting? And I'll tell you why it's exciting. We all have things in our lives that we got wrong. Things we said we shouldn't have said, decisions we made that were wrong, people we hurt, people we left, friends who died that we could have saved or we could have spent more time with them. Cheating the ferryman allows you to do that. Cheating the ferryman allows you, if your daemon wishes you to marry somebody else, to not leave that person, or to leave that person early, or to marry that other person, have different children, and see what that outcome would be. Having gone to a different university, gone to a different school, gone on holiday at a different time. All these outcomes are all there. And they're all waiting for you in your immortality. You know, death is not the end. But effectively, death is. And this is the point that people do not get with cheating the ferryman. You do die. Eventually. And people see you die. But your immortality takes place before you die. You never get to dying. Immortality has got nothing to do with the body. People turn around and say life after death isn't possible, and scientists say this, it's not possible because there's not a functioning brain, therefore how can anything be processed? And it's a perfect point. How can you see anything or perceive anything if there's not a brain perceiving it? Cheating the ferryman says, I don't have to explain that because the brain is still functioning. So my hypothesis is completely and utterly scientific. I don't expect anybody to do anything that isn't known in some way or other within modern science. And I think that is the power of what I'm trying to say in my hypothesis. So effectively, we are existing in a hologram which contains all our lives, and we exist and we live within it. And that, my friends, is cheating the ferryman. And that's the very first time I have pulled it all together in one way. And I have to say, I am amazed that I managed to go for 2.5 hours. I only hope that you enjoy this and find it of interest and of maybe even liberation. This hypothesis is incredibly important. You have to make up your own mind whether what I say explains the things you have experienced. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But it explains it for me. And if anybody is interested in joining in with me, I'm very, very active on Facebook. as Anthony.Peake. You will also find me on YouTube. You will find me on Twitter. And my website is anthonypeake.com. All my books are available from my website. They're available from bookshops. They're available from Amazon. My books have been translated into most major and some minor European languages, and there's more deals coming through. There is a new version of Cheating the Ferryman, a new edition of the first book with a rebranding and a new cover will be coming out this summer. Earlier next year, my new book, The Cheating the Ferryman, will be coming out, which will be taking all the things I've discussed here in even greater detail, because even now I've only scratched the surface of where the hypothesis is now going. So in the new book, this will really, really, really join the dots. And I'm hoping that in the new book, I will have the opportunity to meet you guys in person at Cheating the Ferryman, at Contact in the Desert in 2022, when we can really drill into these ideas and talk about these ideas and share our experiences, because this is what it's all about. I'm in your life because I'm part of your simulation. I'm here to help you make your decision on what you're going to do with your life. And remember, if you know you're going to live this life many, many times, it does make you cherish what you do and observe what you do and what you do to other people. Because, as I say in my other books, in the final analysis, you are everybody, and everybody is you. And this is a hologram. As Bill Hicks said, we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Great wisdom. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to hear from you soon. Bye.